Good evening. It's so nice to see all of you. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and we're so blessed all to be here together tonight. We are remembering the 54th anniversary of Bishop Pike's death. And he was such a large figure in the life of this cathedral, in the life of San Francisco and California, but also as a national figure. Really one of the first religious figures who was so famous on television that he was really a household person. And he certainly had an enormous influence just personally on individuals in this diocese, in his formation for priests and even bishops here. A tremendous influence. We have so much going on at Grace Cathedral. I do want to tell you about the GraceArts membership. It's a way that you can belong to Grace Cathedral and not necessarily be a member of the religious community. It's a great way to be connected to Grace Cathedral in a deeper way. So I definitely commend that to you. And there will be flyers for you when you come out. I'm so grateful to Kathleen Kinsolving, and I look forward to our performance tonight. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I just want to tell you how honored I am to present my staged reading version and slide presentation of the play about Bishop James Pike, who we all know and honor tonight, as our dean said, on the anniversary of his death, which took place in the Judean wilderness. How I got involved in writing this is that my father, Reverend Lester Kinsolving, was his legislative assistant. And I was inspired by reading Angela's Ashes about how the author's father was like the Holy Trinity. And that inspired me because I knew that Bishop Pike talked about the Holy Trinity, and then a light bulb went off and said, I think you should write a play about him. He needs to be honored once again. So I would like to introduce to you my cast, who will be reading for Bishop Pike and for Diane Pike, and also several other characters. So Julie Finn and Claire Cassano and David Commerford. So, without further ado, we will begin Pike.
This is James Ferrin reporting for the New York Times in Jerusalem on Wednesday, September 3rd, 1969. Dr. James A. Pike, former Episcopal Bishop of California, was reported missing last night in the Judean wilderness west of the Dead Sea. Dr. Pike's wife, Diane, walked into a work camp this morning at Ein Feshka on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea after an all-night trek to seek help when their car broke down. Israeli police and army authorities mounted an intensive search for the controversial 56-year-old churchman, but had to postpone it at sundown. Dr. Pike has been to Israel on several occasions, a prominent Jerusalem churchman added, saying that he rarely made contact with church people when he came. The area of the search is rich in biblical history. It is just north of the sites of Sodom and Gomorrah and across the Dead Sea from the hills of Moab, where Moses finally viewed the promised land before he died. Ein Feshka is close to Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and the area is riddled with caves.
Bishop Pike was a generous man who needed people and was needed by them. When the church was in the hands of the timid, he was always experimenting against the background of the ecclesiastically bland. Christian Century magazine.
We have lost one of the greatest prophets of all time, perhaps one of the greatest Episcopal ministers of the 20th century, Reverend Lester Kinsolving.
If Bishop Pike is found guilty of heresy and there is no room for him in the church, well, then there certainly is not room for me, and I suspect thousands like me. Episcopalian.
Pike was a publicity seeker with a deep-rooted martyr complex who might be thirsting for a heresy trial. Bishop Wells, West Missouri.
A man of the cloth who is a mild public nuisance is not an attractive addition to any city, including San Francisco. Charles McKay, San Francisco Chronicle.
He is one of the most colorful and provocative men the House of Bishops has had for a long time, and I admire his forthrightness and his courage. Bishop Francis Eric Bloy.
Pike was a murderer, a liar, an anti-Christian, and a prostitute. Reverend Brunton, South Florida.
Oscar Wilde once said that an idea that is not dangerous is not being called an idea at all. Jim Pike never had a safe idea in his life. Herb Cain, San Francisco Chronicle.
Bishop Pike is aiming to revive the new generation's lagging interest in religion and to have religion speak in terms that modern man can understand. The Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Fasten down your storm windows, put on your seatbelts, and I will now open the doors on the hurricane seated next to me, Bishop Pike. William F. Buckley, Jr.
The peace of the Lord always be with you. If you're not familiar, please stand and greet one another. You can repeat what I just said or say good evening or hello, whatever you're comfortable with. God doesn't arm twist. Now please be seated as if you're not already. The peace is very informal, yes, but did you know it's been an ancient tradition in the liturgy, which is the customary public worship and goes as far back as the Middle Ages, only to be removed by the time of Reformation, that the time when Christian church broke into Catholics and Protestants during the 16th century. But in the early 1960s, the Second Vatican Council reintroduced it, and I introduced it into the Diocese of California, although I rebuked Catholicism, but more about that later. Some congregants can be put off by the peace. For example, I remember a very prim and proper lady donned in a hat and gloves in Grace Cathedral one morning where a young gentleman extended his hand to her and said, "The peace of the Lord be always with you." She responded with, "Oh, no, not today, thank you." Could have been an ex-Catholic like me, not sure. When I appeared on William F. Buckley Jr.'s talk show, Firing Line, many years later, he told his audience that I was probably the fastest talker in the U.S., beginning my second sentence before I am quite finished with the first. Perhaps it is necessary to talk that fast in order to occupy all the positions Bishop Pike occupies. Unbeknownst to Mr. Buckley, hyperactivity has always been my pattern of response to disappointment, deprivation, or failure. Have any of you visited St. John the Divine in New York City? What a spectacular place. The largest Anglican cathedral in America, its facade towering over the sidewalk in Amsterdam Avenue. I was fortunate enough to become dean in October of 1951, and that is when the real controversy started. In 1953, I was invited by Sewanee University to accept an honorary doctorate degree, but as I told Jet magazine, I could not, in conscience, receive a doctorate in the white divinity. In other words, Sewanee didn't accept Negro students. When the New Yorker magazine got wind of this, they rattled off an article, "Dr. Pike snubs Sewanee over segregation." I had to. We must obey God rather than men. and we as Christians need to disobey any law that is not in accordance with Christian principles. Sewanee class of 1953 wrote me a letter of thanks. Congrats, sir, on your defense of Christ Church. Faith can move mountains. Racial segregation is such a hateful heresy. On May 15, 1958, I was ordained Episcopal Bishop of California, and I would make my way back to the Golden State and serve at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. In my election, the vote was extremely close. Most Episcopal bishops opposed me because the church didn't want to involve itself in any social or political controversy. And even though they agreed with me, they didn't want to make it public. Evangelical Christians maintain that the church is founded on the Bible. The Bible has no greater authority than the many persons, writers, and editors acting as ecclesiastical officials. Unless they are infallible, the Bible is not. It is simply the church's book. These evangelicals assert that the response in the heart of the believer, which comes from the reading of the Bible, verifies its truth. How many persons have been reborn from meditating on the last line of Psalm 137? Blessed shall be he that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. How many have been brought to a new level of God's love by designating Jews as the synagogue of Satan in the book of Revelations? The Bible also includes the Sermon on the Mount, which is pacifistic to the point of impracticality, and the ascension of Jesus into heaven. This vision reminds me of an astronaut who didn't come back. 1965 was a year of transformation. I saw what happened to the civil rights activists in Alabama on March 7, 1965, and I vowed to send an army of marchers there. Let the clergy converge on Selma. We would not let this protest stop. 2 days later, Reverend James Reeb, who heeded the call amongst thousands of others, was bludgeoned to death as he was leaving an integrated restaurant. More than any single thing, Reeb's murder galvanized the conscience of the nation and promptly evoked the President's Voting Rights Bill. When Dr. Martin Luther King issued the call for clergy to go to Selma, Jim Reeb quickly made his decision. When he told his wife, Marie, her lower lip began to tremble. In her mind, as in the minds of millions of Americans, was what she had seen on the television screen not 24 hours before. The horror of the bull whippings and face stompings in Selma on that unforgettable Sunday night. She thought of their 4 children and of their life together. I don't want you to go, was her response. There are others to go. You belong here. No, he replied, I belong there. In life and in death, Jim Reeb displayed the meaning of a familiar passage. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus, who being in the image of God, emptied himself, did not care about reputation, took the role of a servant, and was obedient to death. Jesus truly was the man for others. God shone through him more than any other person. 3 days after Selma, I invited Reverend Martin Luther King to preach on the 4th Sunday in Lent and to celebrate the anniversary of the consecration and completion of Grace Cathedral. The pews were filled by 10:30 a.m. Outside, there was a congregation of several thousand. Never before had so many African Americans assembled at an Episcopal landmark. The fact is, we were in the midst of a theological revolution. The new Reformation was clearly underway. One of my assistants, Canon Robert Cromie, attended a gathering of clergy and homosexuals and lesbians at the Folsom Retreat Center and brought back material about gay rights. He shared his belief that these people were human beings, and as men of the cloth, we should support them. and that we shouldn't have an anti-gay attitude. I read the material and realized Robert was right, and he was very courageous. I found the 4 or 5 clergymen I had fired because they were gay, and I reinstated them to their posts. Furthermore, I always wanted to see women advance to the ministry, and so I announced that it would happen with Deaconess Phyllis Edwards. She was a widowed mother of 4 children and had worked in the mission district and had walked alongside Dr. King day by day, all the way to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery. In April of 1965, I had to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby for the Civil Rights Bill on Capitol Hill, and I wanted my legislative assistant, Reverend Kinsolving, to accompany me. Being the rector of the Church of the Holy Spirit in Salinas, he asked for my permission to have Phyllis perform the Eucharist, to be the celebrant of Holy Communion, which can only be performed by a priest. He assured me that the bread and wafers were consecrated. It was the very first time in our nation that a woman had done this. I postponed her ordination after pressure from conservative Anglo-Catholics. At that year's convention, I seated deaconess among clerical orders. The Associated Press reported Bishop Pike draped a red stole over the right shoulder of the white-robed deaconess as a symbol of her ministry. The Wrights found the 48-year-old widow far more calm than her fellow clergymen at the altar. When Time magazine came out with their Is God Dead issue in April of 1966, which covered the current interest in necrotheologians, those proclaiming the death of God, I waved it from the pulpit at St. Thomas in New York City and told the congregation, I agree with those who say God is dead, if by that you mean that belief in him figures less and less in Western culture. What I don't understand is the statement that God once existed and then died. As parishioner Mary Baugh once wrote to me, no, God is not dead. Something within us has died instead. In the fall of 1967, I joined 20 other Episcopal bishops in issuing an appeal to President Johnson and the Congress to cease the bombing of North Vietnam and employ every other means of de-escalation in order to terminate the undeclared war in Vietnam. According to the San Francisco report, when the Episcopal General Convention House of Deputies voted down a similar measure, a group of young people staged a silent parade carrying signs declaring, "You let us down, but we love you." Although I was no longer the Bishop of California, I remained a bishop, and I protested the war by wearing the pectoral cross with a peace sign. After my successor, Bishop Myers declared that my former marriage to Esther was spiritually dead. He agreed to marry Diane Kennedy and me on November 14, 1968 at Grace Cathedral. I had met Diane when I was teaching 2 summer courses at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, the New Theology and the New Morality 2 years earlier. Myers sent a telegram on October 29 stating that he doubted that our marriage would succeed. 15 days later, he wired again that I should apply 18 months later. After I received no response from the 2 telegrams I sent the bishop, I notified him on December 10 that we would marry on the 20th at Willow Glen United Methodist in San Jose. Because I married Diane without permission, Myers issued a request to all Episcopal bishops that I should be banned from the pulpit in his diocese, as well as the rest of the nation. I never received another invitation to perform another priestly function, and all my preaching engagements across the country were canceled. Diane and I discussed a trial to clear my name, which seemed like a fruitless waste of time and effort, so we made another decision. In April 1969, Look magazine published an interview about why I decided to leave the church. I told them I'm still a Christian and that I've been shaped by the Christian heritage, and I still believe in God and Jesus, insurrection, and life after death. But most importantly, the way Bishop Myers treated Diane and me touched me in the deepest levels. If I wasn't allowed to perform the duties of a bishop, which is what I still was, then bearing the title was an absurdity. Diane and I established the Foundation for Religious Transition to help those like us who found themselves locked out of institutionalized religion. I was kicked out of my own brethren. What could I do if I still wanted to serve God? My wife and I decided to undertake a new ministry outside of the church. We wanted to clear a way into the wilderness toward a more spiritually and historically truthful Christianity. We planned a trip to the Holy Land. We had been married for 9 months, so we also considered this journey as a honeymoon. On Monday, September 1, 1969, Diane and I took off for a day trip from our hotel on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem to the caves in the Judean wilderness, and we're planning to return to have dinner at 7:30 with Professor David Flusser, a scholar at Hebrew University, who had written on Masonic figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We rented a white Ford Cortina Roadster from Avis with a really rotten map and 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. We left afternoon, hoping to travel up cliffs overlooking Qumran on the Dead Sea. We expected to be back at the hotel in the late afternoon after stopping to take photos and savor the ambiance of the wilderness. I wanted to understand Jesus' experience there when he spent 40 days and nights fasting, praying, and being tempted by Satan 3 times. I was hoping this research would culminate into a book on the historical Jesus. The scene of Arab villages and empty riverbeds was spectacular. Diane and I breathed in the delicious, clean air and were fascinated by the sprawl of the desert. It was such a haunting beauty. As we drove deeper and deeper into the desert, about 26 miles south of Bethlehem, we made a wrong turn onto a dirt road that was impassable. The right rear wheel of the Cortina got stuck in a very deep rut as we attempted to turn around. As the wheel continued to spin helplessly, we realized we weren't going anywhere. It was nearly 3 p.m. and 130 degrees Fahrenheit. We had no water, only 2 Cokes. I told my darling wife, we're really in trouble. We went into the trunk and took out the jack, but didn't know how to work it. There were no instructions, no driver's manual. Diane told me that she'd learned that someone could survive in the desert without water for 7 hours. So we decided to start walking toward the Dead Sea. I reminded her about our dinner engagement at 7:30 and said, Professor Flusser will just have to understand. We drank almost 1 Coke, but lost a lot from the fizz pouring out of the bottle. We were terribly thirsty, our mouths immediately drying out as we tried to talk. Diane tucked the car keys down in her bra, and we left the car, not bothering to close the doors or shut the trunk. I took off my trousers and began walking in my loafers. Diane was wearing a light cotton dress and flimsy sandals. She used that miserable Avis map to shield her head from the blasting sun. I used my sports shirt. I walked ahead of Diane, who was slowed down by her ankles, turning on the rocks underneath us. After half an hour of profuse sweating, we stopped walking. I had to drink the rest of the Coke. Diane thought we should save it, but I told her, I have to have some now. Oh, I can't go on. Even though I hadn't had a cocktail in over 5 years, I felt dizzy, like I was drunk. We didn't know it, but we were descending into a winding canyon. We found a shallow cave with an overhanging rock and stretched out in it, our bodies covered in shade except for our feet. That's when the flies swarmed all over us. We were so depleted, we couldn't even shoo them off. I urinated and put it in my wife's lips. She swallowed it, grateful for anything wet. I rinsed my mouth and spit it out. Then we washed ourselves with it. It was all so refreshing and such a relief from the piercing heat. Diane looked up and thought she saw the caves of Qumran. where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered over 20 years ago. We walked on so hopefully, only to discover it wasn't Qumran at all. I told her I had to sleep. I tucked my trousers under my head for a pillow, and I asked Diane to fan the flies off my face. The sun was setting, and after a while, Diane said we needed to keep moving in order to get help. I said I just couldn't. I had to sleep. She got up to leave me and to get help, and I told her to bring lots of water and yell, "Help!" as she went along. Along with our loving goodbyes, I said if I died here in the desert, I would be at peace and I would have no regrets. I felt that I had come home. Diane made her descent into the canyon.
I could feel my flesh being torn. My legs got bumped and scraped, my feet bruised and cut, my bottom gouged, my hands and arms punctured and lacerated. I plunged head over heels through the air toward the bottom of the canyon. I struck my right elbow on a rock, breaking the fall. I was not shaken by the experience. In fact, a feeling of near elation filled me as I realized that fear of death had no power over me. I felt utterly confident that if my body died, I would go on living. The same assurance filled me with regard to Jim. This struggle was for the life of our physical bodies, but our personhood was not at stake. We would live on. Help us! Help us! Help us! Somebody! Shalom! The only answer was the echo of my own voice in the canyon. In spite of this, I was elated. I yelled again, I will make it now. I will be able to bring you help, Jim! Again into the night, I hollered, I'm coming soon, my darling. I'll bring help. It's okay, Jim, I can help you now. I will bring help. I'll be back, my darling. I'll be back with help.
After 10 hours of a near-death struggle making her way down the Judean cliffs, Diane found her way to a road that led to an Arab workers' camp near the Dead Sea. She could barely walk any longer and fell to the ground.
Help me, I called desperately. Shalom.
The workers revived her.
A cry came back. Shalom.
The workers revived her with as much water and tea as she could drink and fed her, cleaned her, and dressed her wounds until the army arrived. For the next days, they sent out a search party to find me. I had left the place where I had said goodbye. I walked on until I reached a pool of water further down the canyon, where I drank and swam. I was so relieved and grateful. I left my undershorts and Diane's contact lens case in the water to signal where I was. And then, as I continued walking along the canyon, I fell at least 60 feet to my death. I was found on a group of rocks in a crevice, my left arm and legs caught under me. I was in a kneeling position as if I was praying. The search party found me 5 days later on September 7th. My burial certificate read as follows: advanced putrefaction, fractured ribs. The cause of death was listed as injuries from fall, exhaustion, and exposure. In an attempt to find me, clairvoyant Anna Twiggs channeled my words during a seance. I don't belong anywhere, do I? When I was
taken in to identify Jim's body, Chief Abe Ben Shmuel told me that Jim was very fortunate to have fallen, for to die a desert death is terribly painful and slow. The sun does terrible things to the body. After only 6 hours lying in the sun, a man's body turns red. In 8 hours, it turns blue, and after 12 hours, it's entirely black. As the body dries out, it swells to almost twice its normal size, and the smell is very strong. The story of Lazarus flashed into my mind. Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. John 11:39. The chief told me that I would have to be very strong and that this would be very hard. I told him I would be all right. I felt strong inside. I knew Jim was at peace.
The widow of Dr. James Pike said yesterday in Jerusalem that she had a vision of her husband dying in the Judean wilderness the night before his body was found. Mrs. Pike said the vision had come to her in her room at the Intercontinental Hotel, where she was awakened from sleep. A few hours later, a search party found his body on a crag. The former bishop had been dead several days. In describing the vision, Mrs. Pike said she was awakened by 2 sharp knocks on her door, but opened it to find no one there. Returning to her bed, she closed her eyes and saw the figure of a woman approaching. She said,
When I opened my eyes, I could still see her. She was walking toward me. There was an extremely kind smile on her face, and I thought that was death. I said out loud, "No, please, go away." And she disappeared.
2 hours later, at 3:30 a.m., she was awakened by voices saying,
All of the mediums say he's dying.
Sitting up in bed, she began praying.
Oh, please don't let him die now. Just a few more hours before we find him.
Then she saw her second vision. It was of her husband lying still on a cliff ledge, similar but not exactly like the place he was to be found that day. Mrs. Pike said she went next door to her brother's room to describe what she had seen, and in the course of talking to him, the vision returned. This time, however, she could see her husband's spirit wrenching loose from his body. She described it as white and cloud-like, human-shaped, but with no discernible limbs.
Even though it had no mouth, I saw that he was smiling.
The spirit drifted up to the canyon top, where a large group of similar spirits was gathered. Among them, Mrs. Pike said, she recognized Jim Jr. The vision ended with the spirits drifting upwards. Mrs. Pike said she had never had a vision before or since.
The body was covered with a light blue sheet, and he had been placed in a coffin-shaped tin box. As the chief led me up to the box, he lifted the sheet and began to pull it down, exposing the head. The stench was terrible, and I looked to see Jim's head completely black and very enlarged. His eyes were completely gone. There were only sockets surrounded by swollen flesh. His mouth was open, but his nose and ears were hardly distinguishable. His neck was so swollen that from the back of his head down to his back, there was only straight black flesh. There was no hair on his head. The fingers were already eaten away by maggots, leaving red and white flesh exposed, and the ring sunken in flesh and surrounded and covered by the larva. I was ready to see Jim's body in a state of decay, for I knew he was no longer at home in it. He had taken up residence elsewhere and nowhere. He was free now to be a true nomadic spirit. For the wind blows where it will. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So with everyone who is born from spirit. John 3:8. Jim was no longer bound by his body.
I was buried in St. Peter's Protestant Cemetery in Jaffa, Israel, where they planted trees on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Later, a stone was erected over my grave. It was limestone quarried near Jerusalem. Diane asked that it be left rough on the sides and back to symbolize the rocks in the Judean desert. What happened in the wilderness wasn't so much a death as it was a birth. The London Times said I was a wild, tempestuous, and lonely spirit who had attempted to revolutionize establishmentarian Christianity. I think that sums it all up quite nicely.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a special broadcast to pay tribute to Bishop James Pike, who recently perished in the Judean wilderness. Our guest tonight is William Stringfellow. What can you tell us about the late Bishop Pike, Mr. Stringfellow?
Well, I knew Jim very well. He was a good friend of mine. In fact, he came to the hospital after I had surgery, and as they wheeled me back to my room, Jim said, "Well, I'm a bishop. I should do something." He went out for a few minutes and he returned with my attending nurse and a large bottle of petroleum jelly. He consecrated it and he declared to the nurse in typical Pike humor that this substance has now been set apart for uses other than those ordinary and familiar for Vaseline. Taking a thumbful, he came to the bedside and he anointed me, signing my forehead with the cross and saying, "I anoint you in the name of God, beseeching the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all your pain and sickness of body be put to flight, the blessing of health be restored to you. Amen." Well, when the surgeon came and told me that my recovery was spectacular, I told him, "What else would you expect? I was anointed by Bishop Pike." What else would you expect?
Suffering does not mean tragedy. Suffering is tragic when it is without meaning and without fruit. Suffering embitters and hurts when one cannot evoke from it new fulfillment. Jesus' passion is unique, not in the degree of suffering, but in the power and meaning which came forth from that suffering. Especially so when one voluntarily enters suffering, as Jesus did. But even when the suffering comes upon us in a way we cannot avoid it, our acceptance of it can have a similar voluntary character, and thus lose its degradation when we accept it as a means of grace and seek positively to use it in the service of God and our neighbor. The time you've been listening to me is as much a part of eternity and as at any period beyond death. I invite you to participate in the fullness of God's gift of eternal life, which can be manifested and enjoyed right now. We can do so with courage, knowing that these days are not all there is. We're involved in a very long-range program.